At my son's wedding, he handed me an envelope that said, I was nothing to him. If you're watching this, pause for just a second and take a breath with me. Because what I'm about to tell you happened in less than 10 seconds, and it erased 35 years of being a father. The wedding was supposed to be perfect. White linens, crystal glasses, a country club so quiet you could hear silverware touch porcelain. The kind of place where people lower their voices out of habit, not respect. My son stood at the center of it all. Tailored suit, confident smile, surrounded by people who suddenly remembered his name now that he was successful. I stood beside my wife, my hand resting lightly on her back, proud in the quiet way men my age are proud. Not loud, not showy, just grateful we lived long enough to see our child get married. Then it happened. My wife brushed past the bride's chair, just barely. A snag, small, almost invisible, caught the edge of the wedding dress. A soft, tearing sound. No gasp, no scream, just fabric giving way. Before either of us could apologize, my son turned. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask what happened. He picked up a glass of red wine and without hesitation, threw it straight into my wife's face. The room froze. Red splashed across white silk, across her hair, across her cheek. My wife didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, stunned, wine dripping from her chin onto the floor. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else looked away. And my son said, cold and clear, "She had no right." I stepped forward. Instinct, muscle memory. The same instinct that made me work overtime, that made me pull from my retirement account, that made me pay his debts quietly so his name stayed clean. "Son," I said. He cut me off by handing me an envelope. Plain, white, no seal. I opened it because I thought it was an apology, because fathers always expect that, even when we shouldn't. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, in my son's handwriting, were 8 words that burned deeper than any insult I'd ever heard. "Dad, I'm not your son." No explanation, no emotion, just that. He leaned in close enough that only I could hear him. "You don't get to speak for me anymore." The music started again. Soft jazz, like nothing had happened. People shifted in their seats, relieved the discomfort wasn't theirs to carry. My wife wiped her face with a napkin that was already stained red. I didn't yell. I didn't tear the paper. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. In that moment, something inside me went quiet. Not angry, not broken, just switched off. Because when a man disowns the father who built him, who paid for his mistakes, who stood between him and consequences, he's not just rejecting blood. He's erasing debt. And I didn't know it yet, but that envelope wasn't about who his father was. It was about who he no longer wanted to owe. This wasn't just a family drama. This was the beginning of a revenge story. Quiet, patient, and earned. And it started right there, on a polished floor, with wine soaking into my wife's dress and my son walking away like 35 years meant nothing at all. The music came back on like a bad joke. Soft jazz, steady and polite, floating over a room that didn't know where to look anymore. Plates clinked. Someone cleared their throat. A chair scraped the floor. Life resumed, except it didn't feel like life. It felt like a room full of people silently agreeing not to get involved. My son turned his back on us and walked away. Not fast, not angry, just done. As if he'd closed a door he'd been meaning to shut for years. My wife stood there, wine still dripping from her hair onto her dress. Her hands trembled as she dabbed her cheek with a napkin someone had pressed into her palm. She kept her head down, the way people do when they're trying not to cry in front of strangers. No one rushed to her side. No one said, "That was wrong." No one said, "Are you okay?" They just watched. And then, one by one, they looked away. I realized something in that moment that I wish I'd learned earlier in life. Silence can humiliate a man more than shouting ever could. I put my arm around my wife gently, not to pull her away, just to let her know she wasn't alone, even if the room had decided to pretend she was. If you've ever stood somewhere public, church, a workplace, a family gathering, and felt everyone quietly step back instead of stepping in, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's just cold. Someone near the bar whispered, "It's their business." Another muttered, "Best not to interfere." That's how people justify cowardice. They dress it up as manners. The bride's family avoided our table like it carried a disease. Friends I'd known for decades suddenly found reasons to check their phones. Men who had shaken my hand, borrowed my tools, asked me for advice. Now they studied their plates like the answers were written there. I didn't feel angry yet. I felt erased. My wife leaned toward me and whispered, barely audible, "Did we do something wrong?" That question hurt more than the wine, more than the envelope, more than the sentence I still hadn't let myself reread. "No," I said quietly. "We didn't." But even as I said it, I could feel something heavy settling in my chest. Because when your own child treats you like an inconvenience, the world is very quick to follow his lead. We walked out together, slowly. Heads held high, because pride is sometimes the only thing a man has left to hold on to. The doors closed behind us, and the music faded. In the parking lot, the night air felt sharper, honest. My wife took a breath like she'd been underwater. That was when I reached into my jacket and felt the envelope again. I didn't open it, not yet. I knew whatever was inside wasn't meant to explain anything. It was meant to end something. And standing there, under the yellow glow of parking lot lights, I understood the real cruelty of what my son had done. He didn't just reject me. He let everyone else do it too. That's the thing about denying a father his place. It gives the room permission to forget what you ever gave. And as we drove home in silence, my wife staring out the window, I made myself a promise I didn't say out loud. I would not beg for my place back. I would find out exactly what that envelope was meant to erase, and why. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Not because I was angry. Anger is loud. It burns hot, then fades. What kept me awake was quieter than that. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle the way it always had. And I realized something that hurt more than the wine, more than the envelope, more than the silence at the wedding. I had spent my entire adult life making sure my son never felt alone. I remembered the first job I took after he was born. Night shifts. 12 hours on concrete floors, boots soaked, back screaming by dawn. I used to come home just as the sun came up, wash my hands at the sink, and stand over his crib for a minute before going to bed. Just to make sure he was breathing. Just to know he was there. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bike on the cracked sidewalk out front. He fell hard, scraped his knee, blood running down his shin. I picked him up, sat him on the curb, and told him the same thing my father told me. Pain passes, quitting doesn't. He nodded, wiped his face, and got back on, That was the kind of man I thought I was raising. When he struggled in college, I didn't lecture. I co-signed loans. When his first business failed, I didn't say, "I told you so." I dipped into my retirement, $68,000 I'd planned to live on, and wired it over without telling anyone. I told my wife it was an investment. What I really meant was, he's my son. When collectors called, I answered. When his name was at risk, I stepped in front of it. I paid quietly, the way fathers do, because that's what keeps a family standing. I never kept score. That's the mistake men like me make. We think love is enough. We think effort speaks for itself. Lying there in the dark, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. When did gratitude become optional? Somewhere along the way, my son learned a different lesson. One that said help was weakness. That debts, emotional or financial, were something to erase, not honor. I turned on the lamp and reached for the envelope on the nightstand. I didn't open it yet. I just held it. Felt the weight of the paper inside. Thin, but heavy in the way certain words are heavy. My wife shifted beside me. "Are you awake?" she asked softly. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You gave him everything you had." I didn't answer right away, because the truth was harder than that. I gave him everything I had without asking him to carry any of it back. That's what fathers do. We build so our children don't have to. We absorb the cost so they can stand taller. But staring at that envelope, I began to understand something most men learn too late. When you give without being acknowledged, the giving doesn't disappear. It waits. And when it's denied, when your own child pretends it never existed, that denial becomes a kind of theft. Not of money, of meaning. I turned off the lamp and lay back down, the house quiet again. Tomorrow, I would open the envelope. Tonight, I let myself remember who I had been and what it had cost me to get there. I opened the envelope the next morning, not at the kitchen table, not with coffee. I stood in my home office, the same room where I'd once helped my son rehearse his first pitch, the same desk where I'd signed loan papers so his name wouldn't be the one collectors remembered. I slid the paper out and flattened it with my palm. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. And it definitely wasn't an ADN test. At the top was a clean, formal title, the kind lawyers use when they want something to look final. Voluntary renunciation of paternal relationship. Below it, paragraphs of language so cold it could pass for polite. Words like hereby, waives, releases. Clauses that stacked one on top of another, each one shaving something off my life as a father. Rights, responsibilities, recognition. Halfway down the page, my eyes stopped. Transfer of financial obligations. There it was, the real reason. A detailed list followed. Outstanding balances, guarantees, co-signed loans. A total figure at the bottom, neatly calculated. $185,000. All of it pushed toward me, cleanly, legally, intentionally. I read it twice, then a third time. This wasn't about blood. This was about erasing debt. My son hadn't stood in front of his wedding guests and denied me because he doubted who his father was. He denied me because he didn't want to carry what I had already carried for him. I sat down slowly, the chair creaking under my weight. For years, I'd told myself that love meant stepping in quietly, paying quietly, fixing quietly. I believed that if I absorbed enough damage, my son would stand taller, straighter, freer. What I hadn't understood was that, to him, my sacrifices had become an inconvenience. You don't renounce a father in front of witnesses unless you want the world to know you owe him nothing. I flipped to the last page. There was a signature line. My son's name already signed. A date stamped neatly beside it. 3 weeks before the wedding. 3 weeks. That meant the night he called, asking if I could just help one last time. The same night he told me he'd finally figured things out. He had, just not the way I thought. My wife appeared in the doorway. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't need to. She looked at my face and understood. "It's not about who you are," she said softly. "No," I replied. "It's about what I'm worth to him now." I folded the paper carefully and set it back in the envelope. My hands were steady. That surprised me. There was a time this would have broken me. A time I would have picked up the phone and begged him to reconsider, reminded him of scraped knees and late nights, and all the things fathers remember when sons choose to forget. But something had shifted. This wasn't a family argument, it was a transaction. And once I saw it that way, the pain changed shape. It hardened. It sharpened. I stood up, slid the envelope into a drawer, and closed it. For the first time since the wedding, I felt clear. When a man denies his own father to escape responsibility, he doesn't just burn a bridge. He invites consequences. And now that I understood what my son was really trying to erase, I knew exactly where to begin looking for the truth he'd hoped I'd never read. The house felt different after the wedding. Not quieter, just emptier. The kind of empty that doesn't come from missing furniture, but from missing purpose. The hallway lights were off. The clock in the kitchen ticked louder than usual. Even the refrigerator sounded like it was thinking too much. We didn't talk much that night. My wife took off her shoes by the door and set them neatly where they always went. She hung up her coat, careful, deliberate, like routine might hold the walls together if she handled it gently enough. I poured 2 glasses of water. Neither of us touched them. We sat at opposite ends of the couch, not because we were distant, but because there was suddenly so much space between us. Space where our son used to be, where plans used to sit, where assumptions used to live. After a while, she spoke. Not angry, not accusing, just tired. "Do you think," she said slowly, staring at her hands, "that we loved him the wrong way?" That question landed harder than anything else had so far. I'd been ready for blame, ready for regret, ready for tears. I wasn't ready for doubt. "No," I said, too quickly at first. Then I slowed down. "No. We loved him the only way we knew how." She nodded, but didn't look convinced. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. I thought about all the times we'd said yes when we should have said no. All the times we'd stepped in instead of letting him feel the weight of his choices. We told ourselves we were protecting him. Maybe we were just postponing something. The house creaked as it settled for the night, a sound I'd always found comforting. Tonight, it felt like the place was exhaling, relieved the performance was over. "I keep replaying it," she said. "That moment. The look on his face, like we were strangers who'd overstayed our welcome." I closed my eyes. "That wasn't confusion," I said. "That was decision." She finally looked at me then. "So what do we do now?" The truth sat heavy in my chest. I'd spent my life solving problems by fixing them, paying, smoothing, absorbing. But this wasn't a broken appliance or a bad month. This was a line someone had crossed on purpose. For now, I said, we don't chase. She frowned slightly. You don't want to talk to him? I want to understand him, I said. Those aren't the same thing. Silence again. But this time it wasn't the humiliating silence of the wedding hall. This one had weight, intention. I stood and walked to the window. The street was dark, familiar. Same houses, same quiet. A world that hadn't changed just because mine had. I thought about the envelope in the drawer, about the paper inside it, about how easily a lifetime of effort could be reframed as liability. He didn't just reject us, I said finally. He rewrote us. My wife came to stand beside me. She rested her head on my shoulder, and for the first time since the wedding, I felt something loosen. Not relief, but resolve. Whatever happened next wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be fast, but it would be honest. And as we stood there together, looking out at a street that had seen us raise a child who no longer wanted to be one, I understood something clearly. The hardest part of being denied isn't losing what you gave. It's realizing the person you gave it to no longer wants to remember why it mattered. I didn't start with anger. I started with paperwork. That's what years of responsibility teach you. When something doesn't feel right, you don't shout. You check the details. You look for patterns. You ask quiet questions that don't announce themselves. The morning after we decided not to chase him, I pulled out the old filing box from the hall closet. The one labeled taxes in my handwriting, even though it held far more than that. Receipts, bank statements, loan agreements I'd forgotten about because I'd told myself they were temporary. I spread everything across the dining table. At first, it looked like nothing, just years of ordinary life. Normal help a father gives a son who's almost there. A cosign here, a bridge loan there. Payments I'd made without thinking twice, because that's what you do when your kid calls and says he's in trouble. Then I started lining things up by date. That's when the picture changed. There were patterns I hadn't noticed before. Debts that rolled forward instead of shrinking. Guarantees that quietly renewed themselves. Documents with my signature next to clauses that shifted risk. Subtle, legal, easy to miss if you trusted the person asking. My son hadn't just needed help. He'd been structuring dependence. I found emails saved in an old folder. Messages sent late at night, always framed the same way. Just one more thing. Just until this deal closes. I'll handle it after the wedding. After the wedding. That phrase showed up more than once. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, the same way I had the night before. But this time, the fog was lifting. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't bad luck. It was timing. Planned timing. The envelope wasn't the start. It was the finish line. He'd waited until he was surrounded by witnesses, by a new family, by a future where my name was no longer useful. Then he tried to cut me loose, emotionally and financially, in one clean motion. I felt something tighten in my chest, but it wasn't panic. It was focus. I made a list. Every payment I'd made on his behalf. Every document that tied my name to his obligations. The total climbed higher than I expected. Not because the money was gone, I'd survived worse, but because of what it represented. Years of trust converted into leverage. When my wife came home, she saw the table and didn't ask me to stop. She brought 2 cups of coffee and set one beside me. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm listening," I replied. "To what I should have heard sooner." She nodded. No questions, just support. That mattered more than words. By late afternoon, I knew something for certain. This wasn't about family drama anymore. This was about truth versus convenience.
And truth, once you start following it, has a way of pulling you forward whether you're ready or not. Before we move on, let me ask you something, honestly.
If you were in my place, would you have noticed the pattern sooner? Or would you have done what most fathers do and called it love? You don't have to answer out loud, but think about it.